Blender 5.0 has just been officially released, and the list of changes this time is genuinely insane in the best way possible. It's just been a few short months since the last release, and yet the developers have managed to pack in so many big exciting changes, as well as address some of the most important points of community feedback from the last several years. So I'm really excited about this one, and trust me, once you try it, you're not going to want to go back. I'm Jonathan Lampel from cgcookie.com, and in this video, let's take a look at everything that's new in Blender 5.0. There are a lot of new modeling changes to get excited about in Blender 5.0. First up are brand new modifiers for the first time in a long time, and these are actually built with geometry nodes under the hood. We don't have time to cover every detail here, but in short, there's a new array which has gizmos for interactively adjusting it, support for circular arrays, full control over randomization, and the option to keep the result as instances for improved performance. Not all features of the legacy array modifier are supported, such as start and end caps, UV offsets, and the ability to merge just the start and end without affecting the middle. But this and all other node-based modifiers will continue to be improved in future Blender versions as geometry nodes becomes more powerful. And in the meantime, the legacy array is still there. The new instance on elements modifier can be used to add instances of other objects on vertices, edges, or faces. Scatter on surface also creates instances, but is more geared towards distributing assets in a natural-looking way. This was already fully possible in geometry nodes, and not too difficult for simple things, but this modifier makes it really quick and dead simple to make even complex distributions. Randomized transforms can take those instances, or instances from any other modifier, and add further randomization. The new geometry input modifier is simple and to the point, and it adds or replaces the mesh data of the current object with that of any other object or collection. And lastly, the curve to tube modifier makes nice, evenly spaced, well UV unwrapped tubes out of curves. It even has the option for rounded caps. What's great about these modifiers is that they're easy for beginners to use, but also can be modified under the hood by more advanced users, as well as used within other geometry nodes modifiers as node groups. It's a real win-win for everybody. In the Boolean modifier, the fast method has been renamed to float to better reflect its functionality. Float in this case meaning the precision of a value in programming terms and not like hovering. The mesh deform and surface deform modifiers now use significantly less memory, have much better undo performance, and can handle denser meshes. The multi-resolution modifier now has a button called Conform Base, which moves the mesh's base vertices to their subdivided positions. You can now remove all particle system modifiers at once in the Particle Properties tab. Freestyle Edge and Freestyle Face attributes are now just generic attributes that can be used in modifiers and anything else. A new add operator, Lattice Deform Selected, now surrounds the current selection with the lattice and automatically applies the lattice modifier. This makes simple, non-destructive deformations incredibly quick. And Merge by Distance now picks the centermost vertex to merge to, which makes situations like this much more tidy. Symmetrize and Bevel in edit mode also got support for auto-merging. And now for possibly the most anticipated change in this whole release, UV selection has been completely overhauled. Selection Sync is now on by default, and selecting a face corner in the UV editor does not also select all the other face corners that share the corresponding vertex. This change also allows true face selection, grabbing faces without ripping them, island selection now works while sync selection is enabled, and all operators now support sync selection mode. Simply put, UV selection has been fixed. In addition to that, you can now pack islands to a custom region that you can set with Ctrl-B and clear with Ctrl-Alt-B or in the UV menu. There's also a new operator for arranging and aligning islands, new options when aligning points, and a new operator for moving the selection by a set distance. You can move one UDIM tile in any direction with just a number pad arrow, move by a grid unit with Control number pad arrow, or by a pixel with Shift number pad arrow. And copying mirrored UV coordinates is now faster thanks to it being rewritten in C++ instead of Python. In Sculpt and Paint modes, the size, strength, and jitter options now have a customizable curve for tablet pressure. The grab, snakehook, elastic deform, pose, boundary, thumb, and rotate brushes no longer show a pressure sensitivity toggle since they did not work well when that was enabled, but that will come back again when the issue has been fixed. Undo for sculpt mode deformations has been optimized, which reduces memory usage by about 10%. Enabling dynamic topology when the mesh has attributes now displays a better warning with the ability to cancel. And Texture Paint mode got new pixel art brushes, which are mainly intended for use in the image editor, and they'll be improved for better use in the 3D view later on. And now let's hear what the grease pencil updates are from our resident illustrator, Paul Kajeji.
Grease Pencil has added more quality of life improvements and bug fixes. For version 5.0, there's just a handful, but they will impact the way you work in positive ways. A new pen tool has been added when in edit mode. This will allow you to edit strokes more like a spline editor. Any relevant curve data can now be seen in the Items panel, allowing you to manually tweak properties, such as whether you want the curve to be cyclic or not, or even increase or decrease the resolution of a curve. Corner types for points can be set to round, flat, or sharp. You can set these on a per point basis or select several between setting the point type. Setting edit points to curves feels more like curve editing. The colors of points and tangents have been set to reflect this. Support for motion blur on Grease Pencil objects has been added, and it's calculated at render time. However, there's a couple of things to keep in mind, especially if you're mixing Grease Pencil and meshes. Firstly, you need to ensure that depth is enabled in your render passes. Also, where a Grease Pencil and mesh object obscures one another, you might notice a sharp absence of motion blur in this area. Exporting Grease Pencil to SVG has been a popular tool. The improvements for this version have added support for if you're converting your stroke points to Bezier, Catmull ROM, or NURBS. The curves will need to be uniform thickness for a clean export, which suggests support for varying thickness might be added at some point in the future.
My name's Wayne Dixon. I work for CG Cookie, and I want to talk about all the animation and the rigging updates. In fact, I want to talk about some of them because I didn't have enough time to fit them all in. As you can see, they don't even fit on the one page. These are the animation ones I'm going to talk about, and these are the rigging ones. I'm quite excited by the last two there. All right, let's jump in. In animation, the hotkeys for jumping to the next and the previous keyframes have been flipped. By default, the down arrow will now jump forward in time and the up arrow will jump backwards in time. What? I know this isn't my preference either, but it does bring it in sync with the other editors. This is actually part of a two-step plan. Step 1, make it consistent. Step 2, make it a user preference. Step 2 hasn't happened yet, so you can flip that back manually for the time being if you wish. That's what I'm going to do. Working with multiple instances of the same armature is now easier because the selection state and the visibility state of bones have now shifted down to the bone level rather than the armature level. This means that hiding a bone in one instance is not going to affect the other instances. This is a welcome change from Christoph Lendenfield. Thank you, Christoph. The Copy Global Transforms add-on has been removed. Boo! Because it's been shifted inside Core Blender itself. Yay! You can find it in the Animation tab, and it's also been given a UI touch-up. Thank you to Nika and Sibrin for that. It's once again possible to select cameras from their markers simply by control-clicking them. You can also hold Shift to extend that selection. Thanks for that fix, Wayne Dixon. Wait, what? Moving on. All of the animation editors now draw the major lines in logical multiples of the current frame rate. This works nicely when you zoom in and out, as you can see, and it makes it really easy to see where the full seconds are. This also updates if you change the frame rate. Isn't that nice? Thank you, Blend Adash. The original plan for the timeline editor in Blender 5.0 was for it to be totally removed and replaced with a footer on the other animation editors, which basically did the same thing. At the last minute, plans have changed and the timeline has survived. But it will begin its journey back to what it originally was, which is not a fully fledged animation editor. That's what the other ones are for. So if you're doing small changes, you can use the timeline for that. But if you're actually doing any big manipulations of keyframes or anything kind of like animation, you use the animation editors for that. So let's take a look at the start of the changes. So what's different with the timeline now? Here you're looking at the old version. Most of the changes are just visual, where this keying set has been removed. Under the hood, the summary and the search filters are going to work more as expected, as the dope sheet data no longer leaks into this information. And on the right hand side, this superfluous properties tab has been removed. There's likely to be more changes in the future, but this is the start of its new journey. Now let's look at that new footer I spoke of earlier. At the bottom of all of the other animation editors, you will see the playback controls and all the same features that the timeline has. This is great. It means if you're an animator, you can abandon the timeline like your Microsoft and its Windows 10. In addition to that, the keying set menu has been given some love. you can now actually see what keying set is active without having to open it up. This is awesome. Thank you, Pablo Vasquez. And now in the dope sheet, you can also see the cache information. This is another update from Pablo. He's on fire. Also in the new footer, there is a time jump operator. With these buttons here, you can either jump by frames and seconds and set the value. This is 1 second, so when we jump forwards or backwards, it's going to be exactly 1 second. Let's go over to frames. Let's make it 10 frames. Now it's going to jump every 10 frames. The shortcut to jump backwards is Control left arrow, and the shortcut to jump forwards is Control right arrow. Thank you, Nick Berkeley. There have been a lot of improvements happening to shape keys. In the previous release, we saw the new from objects and update from objects operators. We now have flipped versions of those. So that means if your shape ends with a .l or a .r, it will create or update the flipped version in one click. The old new from mix has been renamed to new combined. And this copy from object is the operator you need to copy the active shape key from one object to another. It's also possible to select multiple shape keys at once. This is great. This makes it possible to alt-click and change multiple values at once. Thank you. All of the other things you would expect to work in this list now actually do. So drop and drag to reorder. Yep. F2 to rename. Yep. X to delete. Yep. Although be careful with that one, okay? Plus, you'll notice that you can no longer move your shape up to replace the basis shape. In previous versions, it was way too easy to break your rig this way. Now, if you want to replace the basis shape, you can right click and choose Make Basis. So now you can't accidentally break your rig. You can break your rig on purpose. There have been 2 changes to weight painting committed by Sean Kim. One of them is the 0 weights has now been changed from the default of none over to active. This is a much better default because it more easily shows you your rogue vertices. Also, the brush algorithm has been updated to make it easier to paint things back down to 0. Previous to this change, you had to spam the button in order to get them completely 0. Thank you, Sean. Bone transform overrides have 2 awesome new features. This is a contrived example, but it will show you how awesome these features are. Let's just say that you have a control bone that is in a different location to your deformation bone. It was already possible to have this widget display at that different location with the override transform option. That's what I've just done here, and you can see the widget is displayed at that location. Although this is just a visual change, you can still see that the gizmo displays at the true location. And if you rotate, you can actually see that's the pivot point. Now here is the first option. Affect Gizmo. This will visually move the gizmo to the new location while keeping the pivot at that true location. But the use as pivot will also move the pivot to that new location as well. This is amazing. Thank you, Christoph. Melvin wants to kiss you on the mouth. Compose yourself, Wayne. For the first time in a long time, there has been a new constraint added to Blender. We can thank Cartesian Caramel for the new geometry attribute constraint, which is super sweet in all 3 axes. This constraint directly samples a vector, quaternion, or a 4x4 matrix attribute from geometry and can apply that to the transforms of what you add the constraint to. So that's an object or a bone. If that sounds cool, yes it is. I'll show you a few quick examples. In this example, there's a geometry node simulation that's translating a single vertex between different empty objects, and it's also storing a named attribute. That's not the constraint part. The constraint is actually over here on the camera, which is copying the transformation matrix of that vertex. The constraint can sample a vector, quaternion, or a matrix, but it also needs to know the name of that attribute. That's the same name that's being stored by the geometry node setup. Look at it go. Now I want to point out it's the vertex that's moving here, not the object container. Sweet. So this example was using geometry nodes, but you don't actually need to. Here I have a basic monkey head and a plane. I just want the monkey head to follow along with the face. So I'm going to go over to the object constraints and add the new geometry attribute constraint. And I'll choose the plane as the target object. Now by default, it's going to jump to the first point or vertex, and we can change the index and it's going to switch to the different vertex. I'll just change this over to face. But what if I want to move the face over here and scale it? If I want the monkey to follow along, there is this option here to offset with target transform. Boom. Our monkey head is now following the transformation of that face. The beauty of this is it's a more elegant and accurate way than doing the 3 vertex parenting that we used to do. Plus, it's in constraint form, so we can add it anywhere in the stack that we like, and that is going to be respected. Sweet. And now you're wondering, does this work with bones? Yes, it does. I'll jump back to the earlier example where I've just added a single bone. I'll add the geometry attribute bone constraint. I'll choose the target object, which was that single vertex. Now we need to make sure that we type in the same name as the attribute that was being generated by geometry nodes. And we do want this one to be a 4x4 matrix. And now this should work. And there you have it. Armatures directly interacting with geometry nodes without a bunch of workarounds. Isn't that great? Now go forth and do some creative things.
With so much geometry node newness in Blender 5.0, there's a lot to cover, so forgive me if I don't do a funky intro, but just get straight to it. Starting with what's happened to geometry node sockets, because everything will look a bit weird if we don't get our heads around that one first. The shape of geometry node sockets has always been significant, so what did we already know that we maybe didn't know we knew? Well, in Blender 4.5 they work like this. Circle sockets were for single values, diamond sockets were for fields, and a diamond with a dot told us that the input can carry fields but is currently being used with a single value. Because in 4.5 these socket shapes could change depending on what's plugged into them, which is a bit like what happens to my nan when she watches cable news. These rules have served us really well up until now, but in the time since they were first implemented, understanding of what a symbolic socket system could be has evolved. So, Blender 5.0 is a new dawn. It's an opportunity to simplify this system so it better serves our needs, both now and as a firmer foundation for the features of the future. So first, there's the new vertical bar, a socket monolith. Its stoic rigidity represents an absolute dedication to single values, no ifs, no buts. In contrast, the circle is now the most versatile of sockets, allowing or producing all different kinds of data. The diamond still expects a field or outputs a field, but there's no longer that dotted diamond variant. That's been removed because we can tell the status of a field socket from the noodle plugged into it. We know if it's carrying a field if the noodle is striped, and we know it's currently single if it isn't, or if it's posting Instagram stories at 3 AM. Sockets on nodes simply don't change anymore. Their shapes are now a static symbolic representation explicitly expressing what they expect or generate. This precision now allows for new socket shapes, and we'll get to one in a few minutes, but first there's also been a change to where you'll see sockets, because menus on some nodes now have them. This means that now they can be controlled not only at a higher level, but as part of the systems that we build. Quite a few nodes have had the socket added, and others will too, though it's not suitable for every node with a menu. Now, wouldn't life be simpler if we only ever had to deal with one noodle? But we don't live in a neat utopia, and the more noodles you have, the harder it is to keep track or stay tidy. Enter the new Combine Bundle node. This, in both geometry nodes and shader nodes, allows us to combine multiple noodles into a bundle. And a bundle is a single noodle of a new type, the bundle type. This can then weave its way to wherever in the node tree you need it to go, a single neat conduit for all the noodles combined inside. When it gets there, plugging it into a separate bundle node creates a socket for each combined noodle so you can release them. If we want to add a new noodle to the bundle, we can still plug it into the combine node. But now we have added a socket, we need to tell the two nodes which one to sync to the other. So syncing the combine node to the separate node deletes our new instances socket. And if we plug the instances back in, syncing the separate node to the combine node lets the instances node join its friends. And speaking of joining, no, I'm not talking about my Patreon, you can also join bundles into bundles with the Join Bundle node. and that's bundles, a powerful little paradigm shift of a feature designed to help us keep our lives tidy. But it won't if you just shove it in a drawer and never use it. Next, the Viewer node has had a major overhaul. Now we can not only use it to view non-geometry data in the spreadsheet, we can see single values directly in the node. I'm demonstrating this with the new String to Value node, which does the opposite of its twin sister, Value to String. They are adorable together, but if you ever see them holding hands in a hotel corridor, you might want to pedal your tricycle away from them as fast as you can. The Viewer node now supports multiple input values, and it does it dynamically. Disconnecting things from the viewer is dynamic too, with the sockets being automatically removed. But Ctrl-Shift-Click still works the same way as it did before. The viewer can now accept bundles, working hand in hand with the spreadsheet to spy on your values. And it's not content with just being all-seeing inside the node editor, because now it will warn you when the geometry node modifier is not being evaluated. Oh, since we've ventured into the modifier, displaying the Manage panel is now optional, and there are more updates from the Department of helping you understand what on earth is going on, because attribute text overlays are now significantly easier to read. With text for the corner domain neatly offset in each corner, and text with multiple components now split into separate labelled lines, so they are far more legible. Next, we come to a geometry type that gets a lot of loud love in Blender 5.0, volumes. Working with volumes in geometry nodes has been very limited up until now, but here comes the grid socket. We have a new socket because nodes can now handle a new type of data structure, one that organizes information in volumetric grids. The data that's stored isn't new though. It can be float, or vector, or other primitive data types. What makes it a grid is how it's organized as volumetric data with the industry standard OpenVDB. I'll demonstrate with the new Mesh to Grid node, converting this cube into a density grid and viewing that density with the viewer. To convert this float grid of density values into volume geometry of the same type you'd create outside of geometry nodes, store named grid will let us store it as that volume's density. Now, one of the things that makes this new grid system so powerful is that the values being stored are just primitive data, so they can be modified with standard math nodes, like subtracting the density of this cylinder from the density of the cube. The arrival of grids in Blender 5.0 means that geometry nodes can now harness volumetric data in almost limitless ways, and these two nodes really are just the wispy tip of a big cloud of new grid nodes. For example, each of these has its counterpart, getting rather than setting, and creating a mesh from a grid. There are also nodes which retrieve useful properties from grid values. Then there's the Field to Grid node that creates new grids by evaluating fields on an existing grid. There's nodes that adjust the sparseness of grids to allow more control or improve performance. Nodes which retrieve information directly from grids, and others that write it to them. Mate, the Advect Grid node moves voxel values along a velocity field. And there's a whole suite of SDF grid nodes, which will especially be of interest to anyone who just learnt that SDF isn't what their furniture is made of. So yeah, grid nodes. Woof. Next, the Gamma node is now available in geometry nodes, and the Random Value node now produces better large integers at the cost of producing different output values compared to before. Pack UV Islands now has the shape method options of bounding box, convex hull, and exact shape, while the new UV Tangent mode gives us access to the tangent vectors on a mesh. It has a fast mode, which is called fast because it computes tangents 4 times faster than the exact mode, which, though not so speedy, is compatible in other parts of Blender. The node requires a UV map on the mesh, and I'm demonstrating what the tangents are by instancing a lot of little arrows on Suzanne's face. then creating a UV tangent from her UV map so I can use that vector to drive the rotation. So if you still don't understand, at least you'll be hypnotized into thinking that you do. Next, we have additions to the Essentials library, those nodes that aren't actually nodes, but groups that walk among nodes, dreaming of acceptance. There's random rotation that lets you generate a rotation between a min and max zenith. Then there's for groups with the kind of math functions that some people think you need to be able to explain to use geometry nodes. There's now a face corner angle and edge length group. Selection gets some love, with groups that allow us to create a selection box or selection sphere, both with widgets, and a group that selects based on normals. And there's now for groups of the kind that ask selective questions, one that inquires as to a UV split status, and the others are all questions that have been uttered at some point by Bono. The 6 node groups that are Blender 5.0's 6 new modifiers are also now essential assets, but I'm sure someone else is talking about that, so I'm going to concentrate on the 2 operator groups that aren't. Smooth geometry, which smooths geometry in iterations, and displace geometry, which displaces it in substeps. We can add a post-substep process thanks to closures and their nifty new node color. But what is a closure, I hear you ask? Well, this is the closure zone. But it's not the one where your ex gives you your socks back. No, anything that happens in a closure zone is evaluated elsewhere with the Evaluate Closure node. How does that work? Well, here, passing through this geometry node noodle, we've got some instances. If I connect the closure zone to the Evaluate Closure node with a new closure noodle, we now get geometry passing through here, which is getting there by passing through here. For a demonstration of anything to be powerful, it needs to be simple. The challenge with demonstrating closures is that they are at their most powerful when things aren't simple. So let's pretend that here we are on the edge of a vast, intricate node tree. This isn't actually part of a vast, intricate node tree, it's just playing one for the purpose of this demonstration. Some like to think of closures as functions, but I don't call something a function unless I'm holding a glass of champagne. I prefer to think of it as non-linear noodling, the ability to insert noodles into the middle of a node tree with whatever they are carrying or hangs on them. And we can pass new noodles through the closure zone via the Evaluate Closure node by syncing their sci-fi sockets in pretty much the same way as we do with bundles. What makes closures so powerful is that if we put our vast, intricate node tree into a group, a closure zone gives us the ability to still add operations into its belly. Operations that can also live in groups, allowing for the construction of much more flexible, modular systems. This is like how they get different fillings into the same types of donut. But ironically, they had to learn geometry nodes first. So that's Blender 5.0, a triumphant and transformative update for geometry nodes. If geometry nodes is your game, consider it well and truly changed.
Blender 5.0 has gotten a huge upgrade in the color department. First, you can now output to HDR displays. To go along with that, you can also use HDR view transforms. There's a new HDR version of AGX, as well as full support for the ACES 1.3 and ACES 2.0 transforms. The full ACES color pipeline, for those who are working with images from other applications that use ACES, is now supported because you can also change Blender's working space to ACES CG. Though if you're not importing and exporting ACES data, it might be better to use Rec 2020 if you're going to use a wider gamut, as it introduces fewer complications. Rec 2020 can allow Cycles and Eevee to mix the colors of bounced lights a little more accurately, closer to spectral rendering, though not quite that good. Just be aware that if you change to Rec 2020, view transforms that weren't built with it in mind, like PBR neutral, can be a source of clipping. AGX, though, works great. Also, do know that larger working spaces change what color results when you input raw RGB values into nodes. It can also allow you to get negative values in the color picker, which might be confusing. This is because the new linear side of the color picker shows the color as related to the linear working space, while the perceptual side of the color picker shows the color as related to sRGB. When picking colors for materials and lights while using larger working spaces, I would generally recommend sticking to the perceptual side of the color picker, since otherwise you won't get much of the color mixing benefits that I mentioned earlier. Images and movies can also be saved in HDR formats and wide gamut color spaces now, so different devices can all display them correctly. The image output file type menu has been cleaned up, and the most common formats are now on top. When it comes to nodes, the bundle and closure features from geometry nodes are also available in the shader editor, which unlocks a whole new world of possibilities, as does the repeat zone in the shader editor and the menu switch. The sky texture has a new default, multiple scattering, which is both more accurate and more beautiful, especially during sunrise and sunset. A new procedural node called radial tiling now lets you create all sorts of shapes and tile patterns with rounded corners. And good old Voronoi is now several times faster than it was before if you're rendering on the CPU. The point density texture was removed, since everything that it used to do can now be done much better with geometry nodes. Baking from the multi-resolution modifier was also significantly improved, and you can even bake vector displacement maps from it now. And for baking in general, you can now bake to only the selected image nodes rather than all active nodes. And lastly, light linking can now be overridden with library overrides. And now let's hear about the render engine specific updates from our fellow scholar.
Hey everyone, it's Karo here from 2 Minute Papers. Blender 5.0 is a big version number change, and there are some awesome improvements to rendering which reflect that. In Cycles, Adaptive Subdivision has received another round of improvements and is finally no longer considered experimental. It is now always displayed in the subdivision surface modifier if you are using a render engine like Cycles that supports it. It now works properly with normal maps, and there is a new option to slice in object space which allows for using it on instance objects but without the performance loss that comes with realizing the instances. Metal shaders can now use thin film interference, which allows you to realistically simulate the beautiful colors of oxidized, anodized, or tempered metal. So good! Volumes are now rendered with a new unbiased algorithm called null scattering, which removes artifacts when two volume objects overlap. It works better in most scenes, but can have worse performance in some cases, so you can always get back to the previous biased method in the volume settings. Volumes also render with a bit less noise on the GPU thanks to more advanced sampling and a better optimized volume library. Subsurface scattering is also improved and is no longer overly dark near object intersections. OSL cameras, which allow you to design your own custom lenses for rendering, now support more types of inputs in the interface. They also no longer depend on the blender focal length for the aperture size, which adds much more flexibility for the depth of field effects. Curves can now be rendered as linear 3D curves, which is not as nice looking up close, but looks fine from far away and can cut render times in half or more in some cases when a character has lots of hair. Advanced shader users can now access information about whether or not a ray has gone through a portal BSDF. One practical application is that it will be used to make the free brushstroke tools from the Blender Extensions website look even better. There's also a new pass for render times which can be used to pinpoint and fix the parts of your scene that are rendering slowly. And the option to render without tiles so that massive 16K renders do not crash when they run out of memory. But you can still set the tile size to larger than your render if you really want to. In EV, Blender's real-time render engine, curves and hair is now rendered much more realistically with better thickness, improved self-shadowing, and a more rounded curve type. They also now respect the radius, cyclic, and resolution attributes just like Cycles. Baking light probes which are used to pre-compute complex bounce lighting in real-time renderers is now faster, and the UI remains responsive while it's working. Overriding materials in EV per view layer is now supported. Blender's viewport renderer also got some love in Blender 5.0. the matcap materials have been completely overhauled in response to user feedback, so now they all support the specular lighting checkbox. So, whether you're modeling hard surfaces, sculpting characters, or previewing scans, your objects are going to look amazing. And it's not all style. Scenes that make heavy use of instances are now rendered 150 to 300% faster. Wow!
Straight away, we'll notice a few differences once we're in the Compositor node editor. The Use Nodes checkbox at the top is gone. The Compositing node tree is now its own data block, and so we can have multiple node layouts in one blend file. I don't have any in here just yet, but of course I can just click on the new to make one, and then I can rename it to something. Then if I just make some changes in here, for example, by adding a new node group, tabbing into it to do a little bit of node editing there, then tabbing back out to hook that up in our main node layout there, I'll give that node group its own name too. Once I save this file, I can then jump into a fresh blend file and then go File and then Append. Find that saved blend file, find the node tree folder, and there's our node groups ready to append. I'll just append in the Something Amazing node group, and we'll see from the pull down menu that that brings in both node groups anyway. Once we select it, we'll see there's our nodes. We might also notice that the old composite node is now gone and replaced with a group output node, which basically does the same thing. But probably the most recognizable change in the Compositor editor is this asset shelf, with all of these pre-built node groups that can be clicked and dragged into the window for certain effects. We'll quickly look at a bunch of these, and first I'll turn the Camera and Lens Effects tab on and the Creative tab, and then take a look at the result of the Chromatic Aberration, which gives us that appealing color channel splitting offset. And we can tab into these to see what's going on with all the nodes to create this specific effect if we wish. We've got Film Grain to help the render look slightly less digitally perfect, and in a similar way we've got Sensor Noise, which will give us that random pixel noise produced by a camera sensor. Vignette is a really common one that gives us that darkness around the edges, helping to kind of frame our image. In the Creative tab, we've got Sepia for that vintage photo look. We've got Split Toning, which gives us a quick way to tint highlights and shadows with different colors. There's also the Tune Image effect, which gives us some all-in-one controls for contrast, color boost, clarity, and sharpness. The Unsharp mask will sharpen the image by increasing the contrast along edges in an image. There's more nodes planned as shown here, which look like they'll be a very welcome addition. Another addition that has pretty far-reaching consequences is that there's not only now the compositor nodes for the scene, but also the compositor can now be used with the video sequencer. So all these effects that we've been talking about and more can be utilized for the sequencer. Up here in the top left, there's a pull down to choose between the two, so scene nodes or sequencer nodes. If we have it set to sequencer, then it'll show the nodes related to the selected channel strip in the sequencer. A new convolve node was added, which takes an image and a kernel as an input. This probably isn't the place to launch into a tutorial about kernels, but briefly we can think of a kernel as a small grid of values that says how to mix a pixel with its immediate neighbors. So it's good for stuff like blurring or other filters like sharpening or edge detection. So in other words, we can do some pretty cool custom filtering with it. Probably one of the best use cases for this might be for some custom shapes such as this. Here I've rendered a little 32 by 32 image of the Suzanne head, which as we can see creates a sort of bokeh effect. There's a pretty wild scotopic example here that the developer Omar kindly shared with us and works really well in these low light candlelight sort of situations. And as we can see from the controls and the internal node shenanigans, things can get pretty involved with these. The kernel option is also added into the glare node, which can just convolve the highlights based on whatever threshold we give it, whether we want more or less of the image to be affected. The glare node also now has a sunbeams mode, which basically replaces the old sunbeams node, and it's much easier to use and get high quality results right out of the box. The node also has a jitter input, which speeds up the node execution at the expense of a more noisy, grainy output, which can also serve as a good control for a more artistic look, sort of giving it a subtle bit of quite appealing texture to the otherwise pristine beams. Some other improvements are that the fog glow mode of the glare node is now more realistic. We've got more gizmos, so the split node, for example, supports rotation. The displace node now has an interpolation and extension option. So say if we were displacing an image like crazy to the point where it reveals this checker pattern, or transparency in other words, we can set the extensions to repeat and go on some pretty interesting multidimensional adventures. Similarly, all these nodes now have an extension mode option as well. The lens distortion node now maintains transparency. In 4.5, if you try to use the lens distortion in the viewport with transparency, for example, you'll get this black hole starting to emerge. Whereas in 5.0, the result is exactly what you'd want, assuming you didn't want a black hole for some reason anyway. The alpha over node now supports the disjoint and conjoint over operations. You might want to rely on those when you have multiple layers of alpha with semi-transparency that need to blend together, which helps to avoid any unwanted potential halo effects you might otherwise get. The compositor now has a switch menu node, so here I've just plugged in some of the new filters into a node group, and then whatever we choose from the pull down, we'll use what's going into that particular option. So we can make this as complicated as we want here behind the scenes, but it's made easy on the user with just a simple menu switch. A new convert to display node was added. For most workflows, it's recommended to use the main color management options, but for some advanced use cases, this is going to be able to come in handy. A few things that might be worth mentioning that got tweaked. The dot product of the normal node was removed, so just use the vector math dot product node instead. Since the procedural texturing nodes were added, the old texture node is redundant, so that's been removed. File output node was redesigned for a better user experience and is more in line with the behavior of the rest of the nodes. For example, it now supports dragging links to create a new input. So that's most of the highlights of what I wanted to show here at the moment, but as we can see, there's even more cool general improvements. Now though, let's pass it over to Martin Kleckner to talk about the video editing updates.
In the previous Blender versions, while working on a video edit, if you decided something needed changing in your 3D scene, you couldn't just start editing the scene directly. You had to switch to the particular scene, do the changes, and then switch back to the editing, which was quite inconvenient. With version 5, the sequencer scene is now independent on the 3D scenes, meaning you can change your 3D scenes while you're editing in the video editor. Let me show you. I have a scene here from my historical project, and now let's enter the video editing layout. Now you need to create a new scene first, let's call it edit, and with that I can easily add my 2 other scenes that are present in the blend file onto my timeline. In an extra window, I can open up a 3D viewport, and up here switch to one of the scenes to edit it, and when you have a look here, yes, the sequencer is still set to edit, so I can keep working on it, even while I adjust the scenes in the viewport. And that just wasn't possible in the previous versions. This is a huge deal for anyone creating their animations and short films directly inside Blender. It's now so much faster to make edits on the go, changing stuff and then seeing the changes immediately in the editing window. Here I created a special layout where one part is dedicated to the scene editing and the other to the video edit. In this case, it's super useful to synchronize the time between your scenes and the sequencer with this button. A simple way to keep multiple scenes in perfect sync during scrubbing and playback. And what about rendering, you ask? Which scene will I render when I hit F12? Easy, you either hit F12 to render the active scene or Alt F12 to render the sequencer scene. Or, you can just click here in the menu. A huge addition is the compositor strip modifier. You can now apply node-based compositing directly to your sequencer strips. In the compositor, just switch to the sequencer mode and start building node trees or, and this is amazing, use pre-built node groups like this vignette or film grain, chromatic aberration, and others. This is something I always wanted in the sequencer, and now it's finally real. Now for the remaining changes, let's go through this quickly. You may have already noticed that the strip modifiers are now moved out here into the Properties menu under this new tab. Much more convenient and uniform that way. When adding new strips, they are now dropped where your mouse is and you can immediately move them around. A new footer adds playback controls, and handles for the video and audio strips now clamp to the bounds of their underlying content by default. Prefetching can be now found here in the shelf menu, and it's so much faster than in the previous versions, improving the playback quite a bit. There is now a slip tool in the tools menu, allowing you to slide the contents of the strips instead of just playing with the in and out handles. Besides that, circle and lasso selection tools have been added too. Small but nice detail, strips can be copied and pasted directly from the preview region. Furthermore, you can now drag in multiple elements at once into the timeline. Regarding the sounds, you can now speed up or slow them down, and Blender will retain the pitch automatically. And finally, the display modes are improved, look better, and are several times faster.
The built-in virtual reality scene inspection add-on has significantly improved the UI and locomotion mechanics to help avoid motion sickness. There are new options for that at the bottom of the navigation tab in Preferences and new options in the sidebar. The whole asset workflow has been improved with the introduction of packed linked data. Data blocks that have been imported as packed linked cannot be edited until they are unpacked. The difference between packed linked and regular linked data is that they are not dependent on any external libraries while still avoiding unnecessary duplication. This is really helpful for the Essentials library, for example, so that multiple node groups that are imported at different times can all share the same underlying subgroups. Blender files can now store data blocks that are bigger than 2 gigabytes, which makes it possible to store meshes with hundreds of millions of vertices, though your computer will probably struggle with that if you try. In addition, data block names can now be longer and blend files are compressed by default. More path variables were introduced, such as the scene name, camera name, and current directory, so you can split out your renders to different file paths much more easily. The OBJ importer better handles name collisions now, and the exporter got an Apply Transforms option for exporting objects in local space. Curve data handling was also improved to support more complex Bezier and NURBS curves. For FBX, the dramatically faster C++ importer that was experimental in 4.5 is now the default. It also handles name collisions and imported actions a bit better now. The USD importer and exporter now properly imports NURBS curves. You can now import point cloud attributes from Alembic files. And collada.dae files are no longer supported by Blender since the format has been abandoned for 6 years. This change apparently removed 21,500 lines of custom code, and that's not counting the actual Collada code. It shrunk the Blender exe file by 4.5 megabytes and saves 95 megabytes from every single install. There's a lot to discuss in the UI section, but let's start with the splash screen. The start file options now have nice icons, and there's a new start file for storyboarding, which uses the updates from the video sequencer to let you start drawing and adjusting scene strips in one layout. The theme overall has been polished a bit, and panels now have a crisp outline. But also, editing custom themes is now significantly easier thanks to editors now sharing common controls for things such as panel color, keyframe color, tab color, and so on. Many redundant or useless theme settings were removed, and many hard-coded colors are now themable, such as for curve widgets. Areas that are overflowing now have a nice fade effect to show that they can be scrolled. The workspace context menu now has a delete other workspaces option if you only want to keep one of them, but be careful with it since it doesn't undo. Editors now have more descriptive tooltips. Windows now have a bit more padding, and the split effect now has nice transitions. Temporary windows like the Preferences now remember their previous size and position. The Preferences editor can now be optionally opened in a full screen instead of a new window. Setting the UI language to automatic now works for simplified and traditional Chinese. Menus now stay open unless you click outside of them, and this prevents them from disappearing while you're still using them. But if you find this slow, you can always enable the old behavior in Preferences, and it'll exit when your mouse leaves. Editors can now show grab handles, and number inputs can always show their arrows, which is a step towards making Blender work better with touch input. The option to enable the region toggle pie menu, which lets you toggle any region with the N key instead of just the sidebar, is now a normal option in the user preferences. Up in the outliner, when you shift, drag, and drop to make a parent, it preserves the transform so the objects aren't going to jump around. The selected item highlight is now rounded and has a crisp outline. Also, and I'm very thankful for this one, the number hotkeys to isolate collections now only works in the outliner, so you won't accidentally use it in the 3D view. The Properties Editor tab filter now has icons and can be accessed by this little drop-down arrow. You can now change the active scene and active view layer from within the Properties Editor itself. Font tooltips now show this nice large preview. Labels for non-editable linked items are now grayed out. The lock and unlock icons are now slightly different and lead to less jumping when you click them. In all the animation editors, the playhead has a new shape and finally lines up perfectly with the keyframes. In the 3D view, the 3D cursor now has colored tips to show which axis is which. Sidebars can now show just the tabs for when you want easy access to your tools, but without the menus being currently in the way. Also, the tabs are now drawn as pills, and panels now collapse a bit more gracefully. Full screening an area with the distractions removed is now called focus mode, and if you haven't used it before, it's pretty awesome, and the hotkey is Ctrl-Alt-Space. Adding an image as an empty is now in the Add Image menu rather than the Add Empty menu. When it comes to organizing objects, you can now move and copy things to specific collections right from within the search menu. The information about modal operators, like the numbers when moving, rotating, or scaling an object, are now displayed nicely in the center of the header. When transforming, the Overlays toggle now affects the visibility of the constraint axis, so that's not going to get in the way. In the Material Preview overlay, the HDR preview spheres are now called reference spheres. The composition overlay color for cameras is now per camera instead of a global preference. Along with this, reference image backgrounds in cameras now use the fit type by default. The design of nodes is a bit flatter now, with a crisp outline and less strong of a shadow. Their headers can also be made more colorful. Collapsed nodes are drawn as a rectangle rather than a pill shape, which is great for the real chunky ones. For developers, tooltips on nodes now show their Python ID name, which can be helpful, and on sockets, the tooltips for everybody are now much more descriptive. There are now tools in the toolbar for muting links and adding reroutes. Node groups are now drawn without icons in their headers and instead as a stack of nodes. It's also now possible to enter them with a double click and exit them with either a double click in empty space or by clicking on the breadcrumbs. These breadcrumbs also now indicate if a node group is linked or packed. Nodes can now be swapped out with Shift-S, which was an old node wrangler command that is now in Blender by default. In addition, multiple group inputs can now be combined with Ctrl-J. When selecting a group input or output, the group properties are now shown in the Node tab of the sidebar, so you don't have to keep switching to the Group tab. The node tree subtypes now have icons. Search in the node editor now supports searching for nodes that have references to strings, data blocks, and specific group inputs, which should make working with really big graphs much easier. You can now add more items to switch nodes with the plus button, and the menu switch node has a Boolean output for each item that says whether or not it was chosen. The add menus of all of the different node editors were reorganized to be more consistent. When making group inputs, you can choose to hide the label so the input is wider, and there's a new node called Enable Output, which allows you to turn outputs on or off depending on some input. In the image editor, the mask mode now has a toolbar. Important error messages are now a bit weightier. The movie clip editor for camera tracking now has an overlays panel, and the tracking colors now use the theme's X and Y axis colors. The magnifying glass for search was flipped to be consistent with Mac, Linux, and sometimes Windows, and custom mouse cursors are now anti-aliased in Linux Wayland, and the time mouse cursor is no longer a pixelated block on Windows and Linux. Support for Intel Macs and big Endian machines were both removed in this version, as was support for GPUs from about 2014 or earlier. Older GPUs can probably still run Blender, but they're not going to be officially supported by the devs because chasing down bugs for old hardware was taking up way too much of their time. Also be aware that there are a lot of breaking changes from the Python API, so don't expect all of your add-ons to work with Blender 5.0 right away. And if you are an add-on developer, definitely check the release notes to see how your add-on can become compatible. And that, along with hundreds of bug fixes and other minor improvements, is what's new in Blender 5.0. Download it today from blender.org, and don't forget to support the development fund while you're there to help make future updates even better. I'm Jonathan Lampel from cgcookie.com. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great rest of your day, and happy blending.